A young officer nervously approached General Marshall and asked, "Sir, what's the secret to your success?" Marshall replied, "Simple. I don't engage in small talk." The officer hesitated and then asked, Is that all, sir?" Marshall smirked and replied, "Yes, but don't apply that to your marriage unless you want to start a war. Those always end with unfavorable terms." During a tense Pentagon meeting, as General LeMay presented a strategic plan, the projector suddenly went blank. An awkward silence followed as a nervous technician rushed in, fumbling with the equipment. LeMay, with his usual stern expression, asked, "Son, can you get this thing working again?" The technician, sweating profusely, stammered, I think so, sir. Just give me a minute." LeMay, not one to waste time, replied in a deadpan tone, "Well, make it quick. If you can't get it going, we'll have to go back to using chalk and a blackboard. And trust me, my handwriting is as strategic as a bomb raid, effective but not pretty." The room burst into laughter, the tension eased by LeMay's humor. The smiling technician quickly got the projector working again, to everyone's relief. LeMay gave the young man a nod and said, "Good job, son. You just saved us from my artistic disaster." One day, General George Marshall was in his office, surrounded by maps and documents, preparing for an important meeting. His young aide, Private Johnson, entered with a sealed envelope, saluting awkwardly. "Sir, I've got an urgent message for you," Johnson announced. General Marshall raised an eyebrow and took the envelope. "Let's see it, Private," he replied, opening it to find a piece of paper with barely legible handwriting. He squinted, trying to make sense of the contents. "What in the world?" Marshall mumbled, bewildered by the message. Private Johnson leaned in with curiosity. "Sir, is everything all right?" he asked. Marshall held up the paper and said, "Johnson, this looks like a grocery list. Apples, bread, and... is that extra socks?" Realization dawned on Johnson, and he grinned. "Oh, that must be from Mrs. Marshall, sir. She always said you can't win a war on an empty stomach, or with cold feet." Colonel Sanders approached Private Smith and asked, "Private, do you have a pen?" Without hesitation, Private Smith casually replied, "Sure thing, pal." The colonel, raising an eyebrow, immediately barked, "Pal? Is that how you address a superior? Let's try that again." Colonel Sanders repeated the question sternly, "Private, do you have a pen?" This time, standing at attention, Private Smith responded, "No, sir. I lost it, sir." During a long strategy meeting, General Marshall noticed a young officer drifting off while others focused on maps and charts. "Lieutenant," Marshall said sternly, causing the young officer to jolt upright in his chair, "what do you think is our best course of action here?" The officer, caught off guard, blinked rapidly and glanced at the map, trying to grasp the discussion. He then spotted something he thought was important. Sir," he stammered, pointing at a random mark on the map. "I believe we should attack, right here, at Lake Sparkling Waters." Marshall raised an eyebrow, and after a long pause he said, "Lieutenant, that's the name of my summer cabin." The entire room erupted in laughter, and the young lieutenant blushed furiously. Marshall, still chuckling, "Good plan, Lieutenant. I'll make sure the lake's trout are well guarded too," he said. During an inspection, Lieutenant Combs noticed that Private Johnson had forgotten to shine his shoes. Lieutenant Combs barked, "Private, your shoes look like shit." Johnson immediately replied, "Just a reflection, sir." Colonel Sanders, overhearing the exchange, laughed and said, "Good answer, Private, but I'm afraid you'll be polishing toilets instead of those reflective shoes." One day, General Ridgway decided to visit a frontline unit to test the morale of his troops. Noticing a young soldier taking notes, Ridgway asked, "Private, what's the first thing you would do if you found yourself in the middle of an enemy attack?" The young soldier looked up and replied, "General, the first thing I'd do is find someone higher up the chain of command to blame." Ridgway raised his eyebrows and asked, "And what do you think is the key to winning this war?" The private paused thoughtfully before responding, "Sir, I think the key is to stay unpredictable." "Unpredictable?" Ridgway echoed, intrigued by the soldier's insight. "Yes, sir," the private said confidently. For example, the enemy is still baffled by why you're here chatting with me instead of planning the next move. Ridgway burst into laughter and replied, "Well, if confusing the enemy is the goal, maybe I should ask you to handle our battle plans." General LeMay walks into the restroom at a military base. As he meticulously washes his hands, he notices an army soldier exiting a stall and heading straight for the door without stopping at the sink. LeMay, with his usual stern demeanor, says, "Soldier, in the Air Force, we wash our hands after we handle important business." The army soldier, with a sly grin, replies, "Well, General, in the army they teach us efficiency, clean shots, clean hands." LeMay, taken aback for a moment, lets out a rare chuckle and says, "Touché, soldier." One day, General Patton was leading a strategy meeting with several high-ranking officers. The room was filled with maps, charts, and serious faces, all focused on the complex details of the upcoming operation. As the meeting dragged on, one of the officers couldn't help but yawn. Trying to cover it up, he quickly said, "Sorry, sir, just trying to process all this information." Without missing a beat, General Patton looked up from the maps and said, "Don't worry, Colonel. If we're boring the enemy as much as we're boring you, this operation will be a guaranteed success." The room erupted in laughter. Patton smirked and added, "But I'll make sure you're wide awake for the next mission, right at the front lines." General MacArthur was reviewing troops on a remote Pacific island when he noticed a nervous private standing at attention, clearly intimidated by the general's presence. MacArthur asked, "Son, do you know who I am?" The private, shaking a bit, responded, "Yes, sir. You're General MacArthur, sir." MacArthur nodded proudly and continued, "And what do you think of me, soldier?" The private stammered, "Well, sir, my mother says you're a genius, but my father says you're just really good at taking credit." MacArthur blinked in surprise, then cracked a rare smile. "Well, tell your father he's got guts. And your mother? She's got the brains." At an airbase, a young lieutenant was struggling to park a massive bomber in the hangar, moving it forward and backward repeatedly, but never quite getting it right. General LeMay, standing off to the side with his usual serious expression, watched the spectacle in silence. After several awkward attempts, the young lieutenant finally stepped out of the plane, nervously saluting the general. "Sir, I was just testing the landing gear's sense of direction. Turns out it's as stubborn as my mother-in-law." LeMay raised an eyebrow and deadpanned. "Lieutenant, if you're going to give me a show, the least you could do is charge admission. And Lieutenant, if your mother-in-law is as heavy as that bomber, I suggest you park her in a hangar too."